This is the beginning of a track that I've chosen to call Keeping Your Balance Despite the Wind, and it includes my talk as well as presentations from three of my good friends and trusted colleagues. Perhaps you're struggling to manage all of the demands that are placed upon you on a good day. Many of us are, actually. Maybe you're wondering why your career isn't exactly going the way that you had thought it would, and you feel like you've had to sacrifice yourself in order to do your work. I've attempted to curate a track that'll supply you with inspiration and insight from the fields of psychology and HR, education, coaching, and organizational dynamics in an effort to help you to keep your balance despite the wind that continually blows against us and threatens to knock us down. I'm going to start us off today, and I'll be followed by presentations by Susie Bichovsky, Susan McKeown, and Dr. Bill Reynolds, all good friends and trusted colleagues of mine. So let's get to it. So my name is Seth Finkle. I'm a clinical and school psychologist working with students in public school here in Pennsylvania in the United States, as well as teaching at Moravian University. I've worked in the fields of mental health and education for just about 30 years. And full disclosure, up until about a year or so ago, I had very little direct exposure to the mysterious arcane world of UX and CX. That is, until my good friend Debbie Levitt asked me to join her on her 10th episode of her then 3-month-old live streamed podcast to talk about imposter syndrome. Since then, I've had the pleasure to be able to talk with Debbie and you all about a variety of topics, including things like empathy and narcissism, gaslighting, self-advocacy, earning respect in the workplace, and the psychology of change. All of that content is available to you for absolutely free on the Delta CX YouTube page, archived for your viewing convenience within a playlist called Psychology, Emotional Intelligence, Dealing with Conflict, and Personal Improvement. So I'd recommend going and checking it out. So before we begin in earnest, let me take a second to acknowledge what the title of my talk is about. I love this quote. This little reminder is the appetizer on the dedication page of Najwa Zebian's amazing book, The Nectar of Pain. If you don't know her work, you really should. She's a remarkable human with an equally remarkable story to tell. These mountains that you are carrying, you are only supposed to climb. It's hard enough to balance it all on a good day. Home, career, personal struggles, it's a lot. So when you need to show up and do consumer research and content design and prototype testing, analysis, iteration, and deal with the less than ideal working conditions that many people have to cope with, well, the day-to-day business of the UX CX professional can feel like climbing a mountain sometimes. But what happens when we also find ourselves faced with unexpected challenges? Life can be unpredictable. Things like health issues and family conflicts and personal losses and mental illness and a global pandemic, as well as things like anxiety, depression, other mental health difficulties, can all make you feel like you're not just climbing mountains, you're carrying them with you. And it can feel like it's just you going it alone with these mountains on your back. We're going to talk about burnout today. But first, let's talk about one of the things that can make burnout happen sooner, more intensely, and more painfully. Specifically, I'm talking about mental illness. The mental health movement in the workplace has been growing over the past several years. Even before the spectacularly crisis-filled 2020, employers have been gradually turning their attention to employee mental health and mental illness. There's been a growing number of published studies examining this issue, and the preliminary data are striking. Here are some highlights. 61% of workers say that their productivity was affected by their mental health. 37% of workers say that their work environment contributed to their mental health symptoms. Depression reduces our cognitive performance about 35% of the time. And only 40 to 57% of employees who report moderate to severe depression receive treatment of any kind. What are the most common mental disorders? Well, it varies from country to country, but for the most part, anxiety and depression are at the top of nearly every list. We consider them to be separate conditions, but they actually co-occur quite a bit, and frequently people suffer from both anxious and depressive symptoms simultaneously, which can feel truly miserable. The next most common behavioral health conditions are alcohol and drug use disorders, which again can occur alongside any other mental illness. And then going down the list, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and eating disorders are the next most commonly diagnosed mental health problems worldwide. Okay, so if you're like me, you might be looking at these estimated prevalence numbers for each of these disorders and saying to yourself, wait, only a couple of % of the global population for each of these? That seems wrong. I mean, I know a lot of people who suffer from anxiety or depression or some other mental health problem. Or maybe you're thinking, well, this graphic proves it. Most people don't have those problems that I do. I really am alone. Hold that thought. How many people actually suffer from mental illness or substance abuse? It's hard to know for sure exactly how common these disorders are, but most research suggests that an estimated 10 to 30% of the population worldwide carry a formal diagnosis of a mental health or substance abuse disorder within a given 12-month period. Before we unpack those figures, let's just point out that lots of people are dealing with all kinds of symptoms but never receive a formal diagnosis. Furthermore, a recent Kaiser Family Foundation study found that over 40% of employees say that their mental health has actually gotten worse since the COVID-19 outbreak started. So we can safely assume that the numbers we're about to review represent an underestimate of the actual worldwide prevalence of these conditions. The actual numbers may be quite large. So let's do a quick back of the envelope calculation. Research tells us between 10 and 30% of the global population are diagnosed with a mental health or substance abuse disorder. Okay. The Earth has an estimated 7.8 billion people at the moment. So if we do the math, that means that despite what look like fairly small percentages when you look at them singly, when you aggregate it, roughly between 780 million and 2.3 billion people are diagnosed with a mental health or substance abuse disorder. Most of us have trouble wrapping our head around numbers on that scale, so I'd like to do a quick illustration for you. Let's say, for the sake of discussion, that everyone diagnosed with one or more of these conditions is a sheet of paper, just plain old copy paper, nothing fancy, letter, A4, doesn't matter. Remember, we said that somewhere in the neighborhood of at least 780 million to 2.3 billion people are diagnosed with a mental health or substance abuse disorder. So for the sake of easier math, let's agree to arbitrarily just pick a figure of, say, 1 billion, which is well below the midpoint in that estimated range. If we make a stack of those sheets of paper, with each sheet representing one person with one of these disorders, one person with depression, anxiety, alcohol or drug problems, some other mental illness, what would that look like? How high would that stack reach? Since I've chosen to call my talk These Mountains, I've been giving you 4 possible mountains for comparison in terms of the height of this stack of paper representing people suffering from some sort of mental illness or substance use disorder. Mont Blanc, which is about 4,800 meters. Pisco, which is about 5,700 meters or so. Denali, which is a little over 6,000 meters. And Mount Everest, which gets up to just shy of about 9,000 meters at 8,849 meters. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, in your mind, think through. Here are 4 mountains. Our stack of paper is equal in height to which of these? Okay, let's reveal the answer. If you said Mount Everest, You've chosen the closest mountain of the four to the height of our stack of paper, but don't pat yourself on the back just yet, because it turns out you're still kind of far off. You see, while it's true that Mount Everest is closest in height, we'd actually have to ascend to a much higher elevation to see the top of our paper stack. Much, much higher, in fact. Here's what our pile of paper actually looks like to scale. It would stretch up to the thermosphere, over 60 miles or 100 kilometers above sea level. Coincidentally, that's about the same spot in Earth's atmosphere where falling objects burst into flame and begin to burn up. And with that segue from talking about stacks of paper to talking about burning falling objects, let's talk a little bit about workplace burnout. So what exactly is burnout? We hear the term all the time. Where does it come from? What does it mean exactly? In the early 1970s, psychologist Herbert Freudenberger was a successful, serious, driven guy. He was a Holocaust survivor who had relocated to the US as a child, and he'd become a successful psychologist as an adult. But he was unhappy. He was, according to his daughter, increasingly unpleasant to live with. He was stressed, he was tired, he was ultimately unable to get out of bed. According to Freudenberger, he said it wasn't exactly depression, it was more than exhaustion. He related it visually to the cigarettes that his drug-addicted patients would hold while they sat in his office on the Bowery in New York's Skid Row. They would just sort of smolder and ultimately burn out. Freudenberger began a kind of self-analysis, tape recording himself for each session and subsequently analyzing himself. And he determined that he was suffering from a new kind of illness, an illness that didn't have a name, so he gave it one. He called it burnout. He wrote a book called Burnout, The High Cost of High Achievement, and it caught fire, so to speak. Freudenberger and his associate Gail North produced a body of research suggesting that burnout follows a series of 12 stages, not necessarily always in this order. The beginning, according to Freudenberger, starts with a kind of a drive, a compulsive need to prove oneself, a sort of obsessive need to really hit the best of employees, to kind of show their worth on a regular basis. And people who are enthusiastic often find themselves accepting responsibility pretty readily. This is sort of the Newbie Syndrome. I'm excited, I'm invigorated, I want to do well. People begin to work harder and sometimes have a hard time finding the off switch to their work. They begin to neglect their own needs. They start to sleep more erratically. Their eating becomes disrupted. They stop interacting with people socially as much. The person ultimately doesn't realize the root cause of the distress, and their problems begin to become more dismissed. We might feel threatened and panicky and jittery. Our values begin to become more skewed. Friends and family are dismissed as not being as important as the work that we do. Hobbies are started to see as irrelevant. Work becomes really an all-consuming focus. Ultimately, people become more cynical, more aggressive, more frustrated. Colleagues begin to be seen as stupid or lazy, demanding, or undisciplined. Our social life becomes smaller, sometimes non-existent, and we begin to feel a need for relief from stress. So sometimes this can lead to things like increased alcohol or drug use. Little by little, people start to see more odd behavioral changes that become increasingly obvious to others, and friends and family begin to become concerned. We stop seeing ourselves and others as valuable, and we no longer perceive our own needs. We become secondary to the work that we do, which leads us to feel increasingly empty, to feel increasingly depressed, to feel lost and unsure, exhausted. The future starts to look bleak and dark, and ultimately can include total mental and physical collapse, which was the case with Freudenberger. He literally was at a point where his family was going on vacation and he simply could not get out of bed. This can sometimes even lead to thoughts of suicide. Since Freudenberger's time, interestingly, more recent research suggests that there are a few different flavors of burnout. One type certainly includes Freudenberger's classic overachiever, whose passions flame up so strongly that in time, they simply can't sustain the required energy and they become exhausted. But there's other types of burnout too, that come from sometimes the opposite direction. According to the Association for Psychological Science, there's also burnout that comes from being under-challenged and ultimately distanced from one's work. We become more cynical, more depersonalized, and ultimately we become more and more unattached from any drive to accomplish anything at all at work. And there's another type that comes from a tendency to just give up in the face of stress. Rather than push through the barriers to achieve their goals, people simply become less and less motivated and become much quicker to walk away. And all of these types of burnout share something in common. They suck. They feel awful. And they leave us feeling stressed out and depressed, alone, and rather like a failure. So how common is this burnout thing, you ask? Good question. Remember our towering stack of papers leading halfway up to the International Space Station? That was looking at about 10 to 30% of the population. Burnout is even more prevalent than that. Much, much more so, in fact. Just 2 months ago, Indeed conducted a survey of 1,500 workers and compared their findings with survey data from January 2020, just before the pandemic hit the United States. Here's what they found. Burnout is on the rise. Over half of survey respondents are experiencing burnout in 2021, which is up from the 43% who said the same in Indeed's pre-COVID-19 survey. Baby boomers, as it turns out, show a 7% increase in burnout from pre-pandemic levels. And at 54%, more than half of Gen Xers are currently burned out. That's a 14% jump. 59% of millennials were already actually 53% were struggling before the pandemic. 59% are experiencing this today, representing a 6% increase. Millennials had the lead in this dubious award, but it turns out Gen Z is now neck and neck at 58% reporting burnout, up from 47% who said the same thing in 2020. Among all respondents, 80% believe that COVID-19 has impacted workplace burnout, though how and to what extent do vary somewhat. Majority, 67%, say that burnout has worsened during the pandemic, although 13% believe that it's actually gotten better. Gallup surveyed 7,500 employees. They found that 67% experience burnout at least sometimes. And the professional network Blind had similar data with 61% of employees being burned out. Roughly around 2/3 of workers have been indicating a level of some kind of burnout from time to time. And the common causes of burnout across these studies are pretty familiar to us. Unmanageable workload, unfair treatment, lack of the clarity of our work roles, increased work hours, lack of communication from management, and unreasonable time pressures. According to Dan Schaubel, research director at the HR advisory firm Future Workplace, burnout has actually become a full-on epidemic. Just what we needed, another epidemic. Schaubel believes that the real start to our burnout problem happened after the 2008 US economic recession, even though it was already fairly apparent in other parts of the world by that point. About that time, CEOs increasingly embraced the mantra, do more with less, where they expected higher productivity with the same or fewer resources. And Schaubel says this mantra was pushed down through organizations, resulting in increasingly sluggish recruitment, and forcing employees to do more work without additional compensation. So one wonders, why didn't people just put up a fuss? The answer is probably pretty simple. People were afraid to lose their jobs, so they just accepted longer working hours and more difficult work assignments. This has produced a vicious cycle. There's fewer workers, producing higher output, resulting in increased burnout. Schaubel conducted a study with Kronos, now UKG, that found that burnout is responsible for up to half of all employee attrition. And of course, if positions are being frozen and not rehired, the remaining staff frequently end up having to absorb all those extra responsibilities. And the cycle of burn and churn continues. In fact, a 2017 study indicates that 95% of HR leaders said that burnout was negatively affecting retention at their organization. 95%. About 2 years after the Kronos study, in 2019, the World Health Organization officially recognized workplace burnout as an occupational phenomenon that was derived from chronic workplace stress that has not been managed effectively. In another study that Schaubel led with Randstad, they found that over half of employers expect their employees to respond to business messages while they're on vacation. It's probably not a surprise. Schaubel says actually not having your phone is the new vacation, because when you don't have your phone, you can focus on yourself and the people you're with instead of the alerts that are constantly competing for our attention. He also says that over 20% of employees said that they were always or very often replying to these business messages while they were on vacation. Furthermore, a study by Project Time Off found that half of Americans, and this is probably true of folks in other nations as well, have failed to use over 768 million days of their vacation time that have accrued just within American employees. If you don't take the time and space to recharge and recover, burnout continues to build up. And when no one else in an organization can do the work that we do, we often don't feel as though we can take any time off, paid or otherwise. So we just keep working, we don't stop to rest, and we keep flaming out. And then COVID happened. It's probably no surprise that with all of that burnout building up for over a decade, a global pandemic probably didn't help things any. In fact, a new study of thousands of business executives and HR professionals around the world found that leaders and employees are burning out at record rates. The study, conducted by Development Dimensions International, was published in the first quarter of 2021, and it included data from more than 15,000 leaders and over 2,000 HR professionals, representing more than 1,700 organizations in more than 24 industries around the world, easily making it the largest study of its kind. And here are some of the major findings. Nearly 60% of leaders reported that they feel used up at the end of the workday. That expression, that phrase, is often a strong indicator of burnout. Approximately 44% of leaders who feel used up at the end of the day expected to change companies in order to advance, and 26% of those expected to leave within the next year. Let's contrast that with leaders who didn't feel used up at the end of their day. Of those, rather than 44%, only 24% of leaders who don't feel used up at the end of the day expected to change companies to advance. And just as striking, rather than 26% expecting to leave within the next year, of the leaders who didn't feel used up, only 6% said that they plan to leave within the next year. And to highlight an important point of intersectionality, minority executives were more than twice as likely to say that they plan to leave their company within the next year. Okay, this is admittedly bleak stuff, and I appreciate you bearing with me to this point. So what exactly are we to do about this? How can any of us take back ownership of our careers, of our lives? How do we reassert our humanity and restore balance? How do we, in short, stop carrying these mountains and get back to just climbing them? And the good news is, there are a lot of ways. I know that UX folks are often super jazzed by actionable tasks, so I've got a big bag of them for you. All things that can help you gradually to recharge your batteries and get back to the business of doing things you love and spending time with people, places, and things that bring you joy. I'm not going to sell you a book. I'm not going to sell you a program. I'm not going to ask you to spend any money whatsoever or to commit to anything that isn't just good sense. We're going to start with a list of personal self-care items and finish up with some more work-focused stuff. Let me start with this one, perhaps the most important. I realize you don't often get to hear this, but you rock. You are doing vitally important work now more than ever. And the kick in the head is that most people don't even know your field exists. In a perfect world, you are invisible, more or less. If you've done good work as a UX professional, if you've done good CX work, things just work. We're all less frustrated. We can find what we are looking for. We can intuitively operate ridiculously powerful tools. We have positive experiences with brands or organizations. Technology becomes accessible to everyone, and the world becomes a better place. Seriously, you rock. I can't stress this enough. If you can't find ways to hear this very often, there's a couple ways to try to fix this travesty. For starters, you can keep a log of your own victories, a little daily diary of wins, stuff that you fixed, lessons you learned, things you did well, and review it when you need a little pick-me-up. You can be your own best fan club. Seriously, it really works. Additionally, the UX community is massive. There are an estimated 1 million UX and CX professionals worldwide, last I checked, and that number's been increasing more or less logarithmically from the proto-UX days of the 1950s straight through the present, according to Jacob Nielsen of the Nielsen-Norman Group. And that's a good thing. We need more of you. Embrace the community that you're becoming. Amplify the voices of your fellow UX professionals who are doing good work, and they will amplify yours. And make sure that you're seeking out and surrounding yourself with other people who see the good work you're doing and who are happy to cheer you on. Okay, so you rock. What else? Executive coach Naz Beheshti says that there's an unspoken agreement between employers and employees not to discuss personal issues at work. Fortunately, one of the brighter sides of a dark pandemic is that we've started to chip away at this code of silence in the workplace. We've seen how profoundly the stress of someone's so-called personal issues can impact their ability to function professionally. We can't expect employees and colleagues to thrive professionally when they're struggling personally. The number of people who say that they have no one to discuss important matters with has nearly tripled in the past few decades. Yes, interpersonal boundaries in the workplace are important. They make the world go round, but we're still humans, even at work. It's okay to be a real person. And if you see other people, real people who need to talk, it's great if you can be a supportive listener. And to that end, don't be afraid to ask for help. There's a well-known stigma attached to talking about mental health at work. I know that we have an international audience of people, a number of folks participating from all around the world, and different cultures have different feelings about mental health treatment. We're starting to make progress in the right direction, with a growing number of business leaders internationally realizing that it's in everyone's best interest for them to make employees comfortable talking about mental health. But still, experts suggest that 60% of us with mental illness don't seek treatment. And a full 20% of those who don't utilize available mental health resources at work avoid doing so out of fear that it will hurt their careers. We just need to do better about this. If you need help from a professional, please seek it out. Help is out there. Be kind to yourself and ask for it when you need it. So here's my hot take for today. If you're a person, you're not a machine. I know, after long hours of being jacked into the matrix, it's easy to forget this, but it's true. Juliet Abodo says, burnout exists because we've made a rest a reward rather than a right. Get enough sleep. If you do nothing else, get more sleep. Seriously. Eat nutritious food, exercise, drink water throughout the day, stand up and move around, get your steps in, get outside, get some vitamin D, be kind to your body, make time to stretch between meetings, take breaks, meditate. All of these kinds of self-care processes are vitally important. Even small investments in your wellness pay huge dividends. It's important to know what drives you. Why are you working in the field of UX? What do you love about your work? Sure, I know there are a lot of frustrations. Let's put those aside for just a minute and think about why you do what you do. One thing I know is true of folks who work in UX as an industry is that people love to talk about the bright side of the work. Focus on that. If you can figure it out, if you can figure out why you do what you do, you can ultimately make some important choices each day. Do I feel like my purpose is fulfilled in this job? Do I feel passionate about my work here? Am I being true to my values at work? If the answer is yes, amazing. Keep doing what you're doing. And if the answer is not so much, it may be time to make some changes. You know the old adage that people never look back on their deathbed and say that they wished they had spent more time at work? Well, that's a thing. Time only flows in one direction, and we only get so much of it. So focus on what's important. Family and friends are among the most important parts of our existence. Make them your top priority. And here's your other top priority. Sure, you can have two top priorities. Don't keep putting yourself off. Ritualize daily time with yourself. Schedule daily blocks of time to simply be. Doesn't have to be a lot of time, but make sure that it happens every single day. You remember fun, right? That stuff you used to do? Do it again. I know you don't have any time. Make the time. Schedule it in and protect it. Your hobbies miss you and they'd like to see you back. Allow yourself to unplug entirely from the electronic world for periods of digital detox. I cannot stress this enough for people who work in tech-related fields, and particularly people who are doing detail-focused work like UX folks often do. The word allow perhaps isn't strong enough. Let's say force yourself to unplug. It's hard, believe me, I know, but it's super important. And it turns out once you get used to it, it's kind of okay to be alive and not be looking at a screen. It's nice even. It's sort of refreshing. Coffee or tea without a device in view, try it. No, really, try it. You don't have to know everything. Admit what you don't know. Take stock of the skills that you need and consider working with a mentor or take your knowledge base. Learn new stuff all the time. It's a way of keeping fresh, and it's a way of keeping burnout at bay. Okay, so we've front-loaded the self-care. Let's finish up with a few tips that are specific to work. Oops, jumped ahead of myself here. Meet with managers and draw up work boundaries so you're on the same page. It's important to protect yourself by enforcing those boundaries. It's your time, it's your workload. And if you get to set your working hours, set them intentionally and keep to them. If your boundaries are blurred, especially if you're working remotely, avoid getting sucked into the always-on mindset. Don't allow your strong work ethic and your passion to turn you into an overachieving, burned-out workaholic. In most cases, your email and your texts and your project updates, they can wait until you're back on the clock again. Give yourself a few minutes to unplug with this and hold yourself to those boundaries and hold others to them as well. Okay, I know, you're a naturally empathic person. You're a helper. That's why you're in this field. It's in your nature. That's me too. Here's the thing though, every yes adds another thing onto your plate and takes more energy away from you and from your creativity. Keep a back burner folder for good ideas that you just don't have time to start yet. If managers or clients insist on heaping more on your plate that's already overflowing, it might be time to have a chat with them about the expectations and whether any living human could meet them. But all too often, the worst culprit in pushing me beyond my capacity is me. So this isn't actually a word, I know, but it should be. Neuroscience tells us that we humans can't really multitask. We just divide our attention and our energy between simultaneous items, leading to errors and frustration and, yes, burnout. Of course, you're going to have multiple things going on at once. In the moment, though, when you can, minimize or close some windows so you can better focus on one thing at a time. Try to unitask when you can. You'll find that you're going to get more engaged with the work. The work will probably work better and smoother, and you'll be less frustrated. Here's one that I cannot recommend strongly enough. Since most UX professionals or teams have much more work than they can handle, this means there's always going to be a number of items that fall below the cut line. They're just not going to get done. Make sure that your project management practices include a transparent prioritization method that allows you to clearly show all your stakeholders involved which projects are prioritized higher up on the list and which ones are lower. Carefully label your must-dos and tackle them first. Allow yourself to be ruthless in your prioritization of your work. And don't let sidetracks and other people's crises take you away from the things that you know need to get done. It'll simply produce increasing levels of frustration, and it's going to put you into a worse mindset in terms of the work that you do. If you can hold the line with people and, again, maintain those boundaries and prioritize effectively, it's going to help. And if you're prioritizing ruthlessly, perfection is probably not a realistic goal. Let's face it, perfection is probably never a realistic goal. Excellence is good, sure. But as they say, perfect is the enemy of done. Iteration works. I've heard more than a few UX folks say, ship early, then iterate. Sure, we don't want to ship garbage, but you can also wait around for that one more fix for the rest of your life. Trying to maximize every task and squeeze every drop of productivity out of your creative work is a recipe for exhaustion and procrastination. Set yourself boundaries for acceptable work and stick to them. Instead of aiming for brilliance right out of the starting gate, start somewhere and then recognize that with almost anything you can refine, edit, and you can iterate. Creating amazing products depends on your ability to listen to user feedback. Interacting with users is super important. But you're not gaining much when you push yourself beyond your ability to listen actively. If you're forcing yourself to pile user meetings one on top of another, you're likely not just failing to absorb critical information, you could be furthering your own burnout. Know yourself, schedule things for times that you know you're at your freshest, and respect your need to take breaks. If you're doing design or testing work, you might be focused on one change to one minor function that impacts maybe 2 square inches of a screen. And being focused and detail-oriented is important, but it's easy to get lost in the details. Remember the purpose of the functionality within that screen and what you want the users to get out of it. Think about context. Everything's a part of a bigger picture. If you can step back from time to time and put your work into that context, it can help you to stay in tune with the user's needs and stay focused on what's going to provide them with an ideal experience, and hopefully give your work more of a sense of meaning. And despite all your best efforts at self-care and boundary setting and prioritization, some burnout is really the fault of the work. Hiring freezes, benefit rollbacks, increasing hours, unreasonable demands, impeding the use of your time off. These are not about you. These are about the workplace. And just recognizing this can be validating. But sometimes, despite all our best efforts, we need to cut our losses and say enough is enough. So here's some warning signs. When your work stops being fun, or at least interesting, if more effort produces little added value, if the rewards aren't worth the costs to you, if you dread showing up to work, these are some pretty solid indicators that you may need to reevaluate what you're doing or where or with whom you're doing it. And here's a big one. If you've sought help from your employee assistance program or a professional, if you've reached out to HR, If you've put in the time to try to fix the relationship with your workplace or your supervisor or your client, and still they can't or won't make the necessary changes, that's a very big red flag. I always recommend keeping your parachute packed. Keep your resume or CV up to date. Keep your references at the ready and your ears perked up for other opportunities. The best way to fight burnout is to keep it from happening in the first place. I hope this session's been helpful to you. If you'd like to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn as Dr. Seth Finkle. I will take a few minutes to answer any Q&A that people might have. At the moment, there's no questions in the Q&A box, but feel free to put some in and I'll be more than happy to try to get to them. We do have a lot more content to share in this track, so please do consider coming back for the other 3 sessions later on. And I will keep this open for a few minutes to see if people have questions. Otherwise, I wish you a great rest of Concentric. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with me today.